Hey there, designers. Welcome to Huddle, the show where we dive deep into the world of UX and help you take your skills to the next level. So designers, we have an extra special treat for you today. We have Sheppard, who is a personal friend of the show, a threat landscape strategist and data privacy advocate. He will be helping us explore how we can integrate cybersecurity into our UX design processes. But before we jump into that, Wes, I was hoping that you can kind of break down for our viewers who might be new to the world of cybersecurity and threat and risk, what sort of things you're involved with and what that looks like, and really hoping that you can keep it at a basic level for those who might know absolutely nothing. I know that a lot of us are really new to this conversation, and so if you can keep it in as simple and plain language, and we'll make sure to keep you honest to that throughout a little introduction here.
You know, I'm going to absolutely do my best on that. The good news is that security is actually fundamentally very simple. It's just been made complicated by a lot of hands, both good and bad. For those who maybe can't see on camera, I actually have a visual aid here. This is actually what's called the cybersecurity domains, and this is more like a business map. So first I'm going to talk about the boring stuff, which is business, 30 seconds or less, and then we're going to talk about the risk, which is actually, frankly, a lot more interesting. But the short version is that when someone's in your building and they're doing security, the odds are you just kind of put it in one group. Problem is you have different types. You have application security, you have infrastructure security, you have physical security. Then you actually have the actual people who are responsible for the policies, people responsible for the governance. And it takes at least a good handful of people to do security right. That's the bad news. This is more this thing right here is mostly just a very, very quick show of security architecture in the top left corner. This is going to be referencing things like design that makes sense. This is going to be a feature that I think hopefully calls back to UX a lot. Then down here in the bottom corner, security operations. This is the actual responders to security. These are not the same people. You do not want your architect saving your building. They're too slow. They're not professionals. And then you have in the bottom right corner, you have governance. These are the people responsible for making sure that the good rules are being followed in the good way. And the thing about that's interesting is that basically the architect is not necessarily going to know that. And the operations person is not going to know anything about the architecture per se or the regulations. So there's just so much to cover. And the problem with this is then going to come back down to the depth of it. So you wind up needing a specialist in every subject a little bit to get it done correctly, which is why we have threats. Now, that is more interesting. That's substantially less boring. What I do as a threat landscape strategist is I go out and I go to these dark corners, both physical and virtual, and I talk to these people who are bad guys. I talk to these people who are good guys stopping bad guys, and I listen carefully in these rooms. And I learn the patterns of behavior on how they approach these things, how they approach secure architecture, how the bad guys get around good instant response. And I use that to then, in my role, to identify proper patterns the companies can follow and avoid these problems. And so my role is a little weird. Most people don't talk to these people directly.
Right.
But it is honestly the only thing that keeps me awake in my job, because as a hacker, this is something that finding a corporate job is not something that we're all necessarily accustomed to.
I find that very interesting because we talk a lot about the mental models that we employ and build into a basic product that's to make something familiar. And so you're exploring the mental model of somebody that is a bad actor.
Yes.
So that is what makes you good at your job, is you both have to play the role of somebody committing a crime and preventing a crime. And I find that, is that something that's similar to being a detective?
Oh, very similar, actually. I think it was there was a podcast I was listening to, I forget which one. They were likening cybersecurity to journalism, which I thought was actually fascinating. Basically, that journalism comes in two flavors that actually adds value. Everything else is just gossip. But in journalism that has value either has analysis or it has context. Either provides depth or provides understanding. And so in that sense,
often both.
Good journalists do both. but get you a journalist who can do both. That's the trick, right? And so good security professionals are capable, or at least should be capable, of identifying both halves of the defense and offense to really develop a proper understanding of what steps to take. But it comes back to the mind, always, as it always does, because at the end of the day, someone's going to click something they shouldn't, or someone's going to access something, or the bad guy's going to think about how someone's going to click and exploit that instead.
Right.
You just spoke to an interesting thing there, and I think that just to back it up a little bit, a lot of our viewers are probably wondering, why exactly are we having this discussion on cybersecurity, and how does this apply in the landscape of UX design? You just said, you touched on something interesting there. You said someone's going to click it, that someone being a user. If there's vulnerabilities present within a design, someone is going to find those vulnerabilities, and someone is going to enhance those vulnerabilities by just going about their normal routine in that system. So just to back it up, I guess, how do we as designers think about cybersecurity during the design process? Why is this, I guess, relevant for us to consider during our design process?
That's a really good question. And I think the thing that gets overlooked a lot is the role of trust within UX. It's not commonly thought of, at least for those who don't do UX. I'm sure it's very common in the UX circles. What is the trust you're trying to build in that experience, right? You're trying to establish, you click this is the right path. You don't click this is the wrong path, for example. Just click paths as one example, right? So establishing trust is exactly what the bad guys do too. Now, keep in mind, user experience, UX designers are not responsible for making the website secure. That's the bad news and the good news. Someone's going to have to actually make sure the website's code is clean, so that the infrastructure is locked down correctly. The network is not open. But I've known situations, and I know the threat actors, that the first thing they do when they want to disrupt a company is they deface the website. And when they deface the website, what I'm saying is they change the code itself of the website to reflect a different click path. And then they build a different path upon that to their own malicious purpose, be it credential harvesting, business email compromise, a dozen different things. So, can
you give us a kind of a tangible example of that?
Tangible example. Well, I can't talk about too many, unfortunately, because I'm not permitted. But one particular example, I think it was it was a bank in Belgium, if I remember correctly, and they were financing a group that turned out to be related to Kurdish rebels. This was kind of a scandal at the time. I forget when and where, but it was some time ago. And in response to that, hacktivists went to the bank and defaced the website with all the things you would expect to find in a hacktivist defacement, which is kind of things like this: we are terrible people, we steal people's money, we support rebellions where they don't belong. And then if you want to log in, you click the login page, and it went to a Chinese credential harvesting page. They actually used someone else's attack just because they thought it was fun. So it went kind of deeper than that, kind of more nuanced. But the short version from that experience was that if your user experience produces a certain level of trust, people will follow that trust path, even if it's actually already in a risky space. Like the website is defaced. Why would you interact with a website that's been defaced? It's clearly been hacked, but the login button still worked. It just got redirected.
I mean, I can think of a million websites or apps or things that we still do continue to interact with on a daily basis that have had data leaks. I know that, especially over the course of the pandemic, I know there was a story every week. Data breach here, data breach there. Ransomware. Oh. Yeah, I guess knowing that it's so prevalent, I guess, is there anything that you can point to during the design process that we might be doing that is not stopping these?
That's a good point. I would say if you were going to look at this again from the position of trust, which is again what you're building with your user in this context, is the goal is that you want them to follow the path of your design. And so the path of your design ideally should follow a path that secures them and shapes their behavior. I mean, as a threat actor, a former threat actor myself, my job was to shape behavior to suit my needs. I wanted to steal this money. I wanted to do this thing over there. I didn't do these things. Let's say I didn't. But let's say for argument's sake, if I wanted to, that's how I would go about it. With the user experience design process, you want to make sure that again, this is speaking from the security perspective, sure, mileage may vary, but in a perfect world, that user goes through a way that makes them more secure and exposes you as a company less. Give an example of the latter would be, are you familiar with something called SQL injection? Maybe not. No.
Not even a little bit.
Good. Okay. Super quick version of this is that if you went to some websites and you put in a single quote, a double quote, but just not both of them, just one of them, and see what happens. There's a reasonable chance, if they've done a poor job of managing their database, that their website will like garbage out, garbage in process. You'll just be seeing like random code as it resolves from the login page, because what it's doing is doing a database dump instead. That is a really, unfortunately, very common thing to find. But if you add form validation to that, instead of just leaving it just like, oh, anything you put in is fine, if you put form validation into that field, now it reads that as an incorrect answer, as instead of a try and find out answer.
Very interesting.
And doing that would actually secure the company, not just the user.
I know during my limited experience with working with developers, form validation is something that takes them quite a substantial more amount of time to integrate into the overall design. I guess, how do we as designers know when it is correct to advocate for that, what is usually a substantially larger amount of investment into the original design and into the original development process? I guess, how do we know first when to advocate for that and then how to advocate for that?
That is another really good question. No good answers there, I'm sorry to say. The answer is largely built around phone a friend, which is, not a good answer. But the reality is that there's only so much that a person who isn't a specialist can really advocate for. But what I can say is that security is one of those situations, in a company especially, that it is really much a conversation. As much as it may hurt my soul to compromise and say, no, we're not getting that done because it's a pain to do. There are compromises you have to meet because the business, they have to pay to keep the website running so that we can all do our jobs and try harder again. So a certain amount of compromise is just going to be inherent to the process, which is unfortunate. But the reason why security is a conversation, not just a job, is because we need people from UX, from infrastructure, from sales and marketing to actually come and talk to security and ask questions like you're asking here.
I had a question. So on that subject of like that, when you start involving a security expert, and I guess like Meg, you're kind of asking like, how do we have that conversation? At what point of the development of like a new product, a new feature, do you feel as an expert it is most logical to involve you in that conversation?
That is a really interesting perspective to ask upon, because this is a contention within security. Because right now there's something, it's not a buzzword anymore. It's too old to be a buzzword, but it's called DevOps, right? Or DevSecOps. Yep. We've all heard these words. Yeah, we all hate these words. But this word had meaning. The idea is that you take security and you move it as far into the development process as you possibly can. Problem when you do that, the problem with security, as is with all, as you can see by that chart I showed you, the security is everywhere, right? Every point security hits, it slows the process. It just does. It's in the nature of security. Problem with that is that if you move development all the way into the beginning steps of development, you develop nothing.
Right.
And that's the short version, right? So the way DevOps works when it works well is to build automated processes, is to establish these are the guide rails that you literally as a developer are incapable of doing because security said no early. And you just work around it. So there's no conversation. There's no interaction. It's just like, oh, that's not a thing we can do. Move on. Very much shaping the user experience of development, oddly enough.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So as I understand what you're saying is in corporations, companies, however you want to refer to organizations that are like very siloed, that's when it's least effective.
Very much.
Want to be part of that development process early so that you can set up those guardrails and those constraints, but reasonably. Yeah.
Yes.
So you're kind of saying like the safest thing is just to stay home and not do anything.
Oh, very much.
But
The safest computer is the one that's off.
right. And even then, I'm sure there's workarounds.
There are actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there are.
So when it comes to developing these ideas, like let's say hypothetical, we're part of a startup.
Okay.
And there's no budget for security initially.
Oh, I know this one. Go on. Tell me.
So, hiring a full-time security expert is probably cost prohibitive.
Right.
What are some of the tools or resources we can employ as designers to shape, a product early to avoid some of the work later? Because, let's continue on the hypothetical tangent. The product or the company becomes successful, it's viable, you get, capital, and then it starts to become a real thing and it's a business. And then you get hired and then you're like, oh my God, this is a mess.
Yeah.
How do we avoid that?
Well, I mean, and like just to add to that, it's like it can cost the company quite a bit of money and users when there is a huge breach like that.
Yes.
Especially for a startup, it could be possibly detrimental if they lose the trust of their users for good. So I guess, to Cameron's point, how do we, if we don't have the budget or we can't advocate for the budget to bring in a specialist, how do we, I guess, go about that?
See, that's, I think, maybe the superpower of UX in this particular circumstance is that no one's going to blame you when it breaches. No one's going to blame you at all. They're not even going to think of UX as part of this equation. Odds are there's a piece of the exploit or a piece of the security incident that the UX was responsible for, but it's all going to fall in the hands of the infrastructure people and the application people. It's not going to fall in the hands of UX to take any of the blame, which is, fortunate, right? But therein lies almost the secret superpower of it. You basically get to see it all happen, and you get to kind of have an eye on it, right? So in terms of like how you would begin that process from security, from the design perspective, this is an untapped resource in the industry. I feel strongly about this. I've actually been trying to raise the conversation on the subject of we need to better UX awareness of security because of this. Everything's built on the idea of, the OWASP top 10, which is the application top 10 most common things. SQL injection is one of those top 10, for example. They're talking about the CIS baselines for AWS. It's like, that's, again, more acronyms. Doesn't matter now. But actually, like, where to begin? I would start with just asking questions of leadership, like who is responsible for making sure that we're not making mistakes on security, and just raise the questions. Just be nosy about it, because the best part about it is because you're in UX, you get to ask lots of questions.
Right.
You get to like be the ear against the wall on literally every part of the application development process, because you have to be involved in every part of the application development process to a point, even the back end to some degree. So you get to be the silent watchdogs and get to like ask the awkward questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, it is our job to advocate for the bad actors as well as the users we're designing for. And so what you're suggesting is kind of, as I understand it, to just bring up that question, leave it in the room, and step back and say, this is someone else's job, but I'm thinking about it.
Yes.
I think that's a very good point. And I think that is our job when we're especially referring to like product development. That's a personal interest of mine. I don't feel like I have such strong, visual design senses and skills. So I feel like that's what I'm going to lean on, is more how I develop and shape a company or a product. So I guess what you're saying is, you can't plan for everything. You're definitely not going to be successful if you think about it like that. But bringing that up early, I think, is a very good point. And I think that is really all you can do.
Sadly, yes, but I think there's a very interesting overlap between hackers and UX designers. And I think it's really interesting to bring this up just on the subject, which is, without going into the hacker manifesto, because frankly, that's not why everyone's here. The things that make a hacker, and keep in mind, hacker is not a bad word, it's just a word. Seeking puzzles and liking novelty. I don't think anyone in this room dislikes puzzles. I don't think anyone in this room dislikes novelty. I think everyone who works in UX seeks novelty. just all the time. Because
I think you also didn't mention empathy, and I think that is the biggest overlap, because it's for you to be successful at your job, you need to also be able to put yourself in the minds of these actors who would, whether it's good or bad, you have to have empathy for them to be able to understand why they would be doing this and also how they would be going about that.
Very good point. Indeed. And so I think the interesting part about that overlap is that if you share a mind space, then you're basically 9/10 of the way already to understanding what could be done accidentally or on purpose. Because honestly, bad UX can also lead to accidental mistakes, accidental stuff, pardon my language.
Could it be valuable then during the process to be essentially crafting out a persona of who the bad actor could be as well?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. If you can raise a user story which is negative as well as positive, that is an extremely helpful thing for security. Thank you for bringing that up. I was going to mention that today. Because you always write user stories for this or that. If you write a user story for a threat actor, you're doing what's called threat modeling, which is actually a technique I do literally with companies every day, which is you map up what could go wrong, how it could be fixed, and how to avoid it.
I guess just to then shape the mental model of one of our users, what would one of those user stories look like?
Well, let's say for argument's sake, let's see, I want to log into someone else's website so that I can pretend to be someone else and gain personal information for the purpose of stealing identity. Like, that would be one user story I can think of. Because frankly, it's almost never about money. It's always about identity, or it's about further exploit down the road. It's always about the cybercrime syndicates. It's not about the actual cash.
So it could be just as valuable as including those kind of like negative user stories, so that you can at least get it on the radar of the company. And in that way, if you're not able to invest in it right away in the initial building, which I think would be kind of foolish to do from what I'm hearing, you would at least be able to put it on the radar of the company that this is extremely valuable for us to do somewhere down the line.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. The reality is you're not going to be able to take the mindset of the most creative criminals, because they're just going to be smarter than us. They just always are. The cream rises to the top, but it's also really heavy. It falls to the bottom of the lake. It goes both directions.
It's a very interesting idea. And I think developing those negative user stories, like, generally we have like pains and motivations, and those are almost like flipped in your bad actors. Their pains are going to be potentially like they have a not a disagreement, but like a personal vendetta against like a corporation, much like those bad actors you were describing that were exposing the bad, the unethical investment in, the people that you mentioned, like Kurdish rebels,
for example.
Yeah. And those are people that we might agree with and find empathy very easily for, but maybe the way in which they're going about it and their motivations are the same, but their outcomes are different. It's a very interesting idea, and I think I might suggest that, like, in a corporation, maybe you even just explore some of those bad actors and their motivations just as like a sprint, and then you maybe see where that goes, and it's not necessarily something that you explore past that, but then you have like a deliverable at the end of that sprint, and you show some of the product managers or the higher ups that this is definitely something that we can show that there's going to be this. It's just not a question of if, it's just when.
I might even add to that and say that you could actually educate those user stories based on what your company's security leader is worried about. So for example, a lot of companies, if they're really small, they'll have a consultant, or if they're rather large, they'll have someone who looks like this. And so they're going to have and someone's going to be watching out for the risks of the organization. They're going to know who the threat actors are against that organization. So you can ask them, which type of threats are you most worried about? And then that can educate and become a partnership in both directions. So then they can tell UX teams, we're worried about hacktivism, or we're worried about nation state threats, for argument's sake. That's fun, by the way. Don't mess with those. But like, there's always these different threat profiles that come out of security leadership, and you can ask them like straight up. It's like, what bothers you? What keeps you up at night? Is it just high school kids messing around? Because I worked for an education organization. That was our biggest threat. It's bored high school kids. We didn't have a whole lot of nation state threats coming our way. We were selling textbooks. So our negative user story in our case would have been something like bored teenager wants to not study for the purpose of going home,
Yeah, could be as simple as that.
Yeah.
Something that we explored in another episode are the very many intersections that there are within the design community and the different roles and that we can take on. In the future, do you see there being a specific role and intersection where UX and cybersecurity meet, and there is just a specialist who is the UX of security for?
I think we're already there. I think when I build security organizations in the past, I build what are called champions programs, and I think everyone's probably have heard these words before. But maybe if you're less familiar, it comes back down to it's not my job to be a security person. It's my job to listen carefully and get a little extra training on it, to be the eyes and ears of the organization. That education organization I work for example, there's about 1,300 people in 6 different countries in Europe. And each one of them had a very different culture. There was I think 8 different offices, and each different office itself was several hundred years old. It was an old company. And so asking any of them to follow my rules was not going to happen. Asking any of them to come to me was not going to happen. So I put the call out for a security champions program. And so I had people from legal and sales and UX as well. And I asked them straight up, it's I'm going to train you with a few specific threat landscape realities. This is what it's like on the dark web. This is what we're worried about as an organization. And then you can maybe communicate to me when you find something worrisome, or when you have questions, or you have a project coming up. You can check in with my team and we can work together. So yeah, actually, as far as a specific role in the future, I don't know that's necessarily going to come together that way, but I absolutely see security champions programs becoming more important as we get riskier, and the threat landscape's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger.
Yeah, I feel like that's been the biggest thing in tech as an emerging concern field. And are you seeing budgets more greatly allocated to security?
Yes.
Okay.
Luckily, yes. And I've seen organizations where it's actually a percentage of the company's profit is actually the budget. That is actually really, really relieving, but only in the private sector. The public sector is the complete opposite. So, but of course, maybe it's a little presumptuous for me to say, but I'm going to guess that the public sector is where UX goes to die. Pretty sure. I think no one's enjoyed a government website in the last, ever. So
that's a good point.
But just give you an example of another threat that I think specifically targets user experience is going to be web scraping and bot traffic. These are specifically targeting the user experience by imitating real interactions. And so a negative user story there is I am a bot trying to retrieve, information that requires a login. But I don't want to log in so that I can sell that information down the track. Mm-hmm. So,
I think that'll be top of mind for a lot of people, especially since with a lot of the AI that we're seeing, one of the things that it is incredibly good at is helping bots and creating bots and training bots. So I guess how, just to back it up a little bit too, do you know the ROI for companies in investing in security early on?
Early on, I do not, because every company is very different. But I think what it comes down to is the same value proposition as getting fire insurance. Are you going to have a Molotov cocktail thrown through your window? Odds are no. Unless you're that bank in Belgium. But odds are no. So at the end of the day, you take this on as a cost avoidance measure more than a return on investment. Some call it a cost savings. It's not cost savings. It's cost avoidance.
It's a good way to put it. And I think that's you're likening it to insurance.
Yes. I hate insurance, but I like insurance.
Yeah. You never want to need it, but when you have it, you're glad you do.
Exactly. Much like user experience.
Oh, yeah. There you go. Tie it back.
Right? Here we go.
So for designers who are hoping to be a little bit more knowledgeable on cybersecurity themselves, is there anything that you could point to that we might want to add to our design toolkit?
That's a good question. I would say it depends on the type of user experience work you do. If it's just straight up like, pad and pen visual design, I would say it's just going to come back down to studying the practices of social engineers. Social engineering, for those maybe less familiar, is that it's the process of getting behaviors out of people that they don't necessarily would not necessarily do on their own, or in a way that would benefit you as an engineer yourself. It's also known as being a con artist. It's basically the same thing. Some people are really good at it. I'm working on it. And if you approach user experience from a social engineering perspective, you can take a social engineer's adversarial approach to the process. Like, I'd rather walk this direction than this direction. And how do I get people to walk that direction instead? And so if you take that approach in your mindset, that's actually the threat actor's mindset. So from a visual design perspective, that's maybe the place I would start. From the toolkit of a technical UX designer, that's where it edges towards application security. That's where it becomes a much more interesting conversation, because then there actually is toolkits we can offer on that process. For example, going to organizations like OWASP, OWASP. They specialize in communicating the worst possible threats to the application landscape today. And you can kind of walk through and say, oh, that feels like something I'm probably touching against, things like that. So.
Very interesting. So is this something that all teams need to eventually employ an expert, or are there training courses? Because you mentioned your champions,
yes,
program approach.
Yes.
Is that something that instead of you were working at this company or this corporation, and then you basically created advocates within different silos,
correct,
which is definitely the best way to do that. I definitely understand that that's the approach there.
Thank you.
And then you can be more than just yourself advocating by yourself. Are there courses that organizations can train employees or managers in to kind of accomplish the same goal without you being kind of the person that needs to be constantly employed at that organization?
Yeah, that's another good one. So I think a good security team is going to have an awareness program already. If they don't, that's their loss, because that's actually where the rubber meets the road. If you're out there to try to educate yourself, though, there's a few specific areas I might start with. Honestly, this is where it gets very nerdy, because at this point you kind of have to actually go outside your comfort zone to really know some of the more technical sides of things. But knowing those technicalities are going to educate your approach as it has mine, because God help me, I am terrible at application security. I am truly horrible. I am mediocre at best. But I've read it a lot because it helps my job. And so just being aware of this is what's going on in the world today. A really great resource I know on can I name names, by the way? Is it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
So you can follow a person named Shannon Morse. She goes by the handle Snubs, SNUBS. She is one of the better security advocates I know. She's part of the Hack5 organization. She runs the ThreatWire channel on YouTube. That is going to get a kind of a mid-level technicality to it. So you get to learn what breaches happened this week, and you can kind of walk through why they breached. If you want just general awareness, there's actually a program that was built by somebody, and I forget the organization, but there's a woman by the name of Rachel Toback. That's Tobac. She is an incredible security researcher, a member of the hacker community, and she built an amazing security awareness program that you can actually subscribe to. I forget the organization's name, so I apologize. I don't have that on hand. And then beyond that, it's just being, just following the news really, really well for anything that's breach, hack, leak, or privacy. If you follow those keywords in the news, you're going to start seeing patterns emerge. And just being aware of those patterns is at least a start.
Yeah, being plugged into that, I think, is just generally interesting because you know how the world works a little bit better. But
it's terrifying knowledge. I do approve. I approve it.
Lifting the veil on that. Well, this sounds, scary as much as it is going to be fun and informative.
That's accurate. I don't sleep well, but I do know a lot, which is kind of nice.
You asked, or you suggested that asking some of the higher ups, what keeps you up at night as a security threat? I'm going to ask the same to you. What keeps you up at night, Wes?
At this point, everyone says ransomware, but they're not wrong. I'd say at this point, it's extremely easy for ransomware to run. It used to be that you would actually have to actually build a payload and find an exploit and run reconnaissance on an organization and target the CFO for a month. And again, I haven't done any of this, just saying. But if you were to, that's an approach you would do some years ago. It will take you 10 minutes and you don't actually do anything anymore. You can literally go to the dark web, subscribe to a service which will do this for you. You point to the target, they get paid, you get paid. The barrier to entry is now down at possibly the lowest level I've ever seen. It's practically on the open internet. And if it gets it gets worse when you understand that with ChatGPT 3 specifically onwards, you now have natural language models which you can then make you can make those requests even easier. So now you don't even need to speak English to properly craft your attack. Not that you needed to in the first place. So the barrier to entry on the most profitable thing that ever happened in cybersecurity, in cyber risk, you can now anyone in this room can do it with no skill in 5 minutes, maybe as much as $20 to start you off.
Terrifying.
Yeah, that scares the hell out of me. But this I think comes back to UX again, because the way ransomware works is with human compromise. Literally, that's the end of it. It can be a phishing email or it can just be a bad link.
Right.
Where do you see the most threat in most organizations these days then? Is it internal? Is it external?
That's a good question. It depends on the organization. It depends on the industry. The 3 Gs are largely the largest targets these days, which is gaming, gambling, and government. So basically the 3 Gs are the ones that are usually hit hardest. So if you're one of those organizations, it's going to be an external threat. It just will. You're just constantly hammered. I mean, I don't play Fortnite, but I'm assuming that they have a really good security team. But if you're in an organization which is a retail organization or a manufacturing organization, odds are it's going to be an insider threat, and it's almost always going to be an accident. An example I can say is that an organization, which I'm not going to name, recently delivered a beta program for their application, and their beta program was using what's called S3 buckets, which are cloud storage, which are used for the application itself. Basically, all the resources, the JPEGs, the XMLs, all the pieces of the website were in this S3 bucket, and it was public. It was not behind a network. It was literally on the open internet, and it was all in clear text, including the GitHub repository. The code repository data was in that as well. And then if you look at that, you realize that the GitHub repository itself was not locked down. So now you could literally just scrape the open internet, find this bucket, copy all of the beta program for yourself, change 30%. Now you have it. Now you have something unique and sell on your own. And then if you didn't like that, you could also walk over to where the code was actually stored, literally look at it without logging into it, and take the source code too.
Wow.
To say the least.
To say the least.
And you think that that's happening out of just no one knows any better?
No one knows any better.
And wow.
It's just that it comes back to that. This is why we have champion programs.
Right. Because
even if you're not a specialist yourself, being in a position where someone relies on you to be eyes and ears, it just instinctually makes you more aware of the situation. If I say to you that I'm going to trust you to watch my cat, you're just going to, by the nature of your humanity, care a little bit more about my cat. My cat's a jerk, by the way. You're not going to like him. He doesn't like you. He doesn't like me. So let's say, for argument's sake, I say I'm trusting you to. You didn't agree even. Let's say you didn't even agree to watch my cat. I'm just trusting you to.
Fair.
You will.
Yeah.
That's human nature.
And the motivation is our relationship,
exactly.
Not necessarily my relationship with the cat or your relationship with the cat.
Honestly, no one should care about that cat. Fair. But yes, agreed, because that's the social contract we live in, and so. Being put in a position, in the case of a champions program, where you are put in a position of trust, even if it's just a paper tiger level of trust, the nature of it produces an awareness which is hard to shake.
Right. So it's something you can't unknow once you're aware of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Especially if you put it on LinkedIn, then everyone knows. Careful with LinkedIn, by the way. Good target for social engineering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, This has been really interesting. Thank you for being our champion today. For anyone who might want to learn more about cybersecurity or learn more about you, where can they find you?
Oh, very few places. But
By design.
By design. I think the easiest is going to be to find me on LinkedIn, which is, again, I was just saying don't do LinkedIn. Here's me doing LinkedIn. If you look for my name, Wes Sheppard, or if you just look for the URL finishing with Wes-we-can, Wes we can. I don't know why I'm like this, but that was how I decided to put my LinkedIn URL. That's probably the easiest way to reach out to me. I literally will just talk at you about this, whether you ask me or not. I'm happy to share.
Speaking of talking, I know that you have some conferences coming up. So where can people see you if they want to?
Oh, yeah, there is that too. I'm going to be speaking at B-Sides in Las Vegas in August. I'll be speaking at the ISC Squared conference in October in Nashville. If you're in the Toronto area, I'm going to be at the Collision conference. I believe I'm speaking there on startup security. And I think there's others I'm not remembering.
Awesome. Well, we will make sure to plug all of those in the show notes. If you have any other questions for us around cybersecurity, be sure to send them to the show. If you found this topic interesting and you want to learn more, definitely let us know. If you have any feedback, if you have any other questions, if you have any other topics you want us to cover, please let us know. And yeah, it has been really interesting diving into this topic with you, and we want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me over. This is fun.
Yeah, thank you, Wes.
Thanks for listening to Huddle. We appreciate your support and hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch along, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. If you're feeling generous, please leave us a review and rating on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps us improve our content and reach more people. Until next time, keep learning, growing, and exploring. Today's show was produced by Meg, Mel, and Cam, with help from Meg, Mel, and Cam. Editing from Cam, music from Half Cool. I'm Meg. Thanks for joining the Huddle.